The purpose of this speaker series is to highlight the ways in which behavioral science can influence society, shape policy, impact business, and improve human life. One of the basic insights from behavioral science is that a lot of the forces that drive our behavior and drive our society is really inaccessible to us. It operates out in an ether. We're not always even aware of the ways in which we're being influenced by some of these forces. It's a little like asking a doctor what's ideal or what's most important for living a healthy life. It's unlikely that she's going to say air. We live in air all the time. It's easy to forget how important it is. But of course, you live without air for just a minute, and you will find out very quickly how important it is. Our speaker tonight, Michele Gelfand from the Stanford GSB, studies the behavioral science equivalent of air. She studies culture. She studies how the norms and expectations and beliefs and values and actions of those around us affect our own behavior, and how understanding those cultural forces can help us to understand a lot of variability out there in human behavior. But it is also the kind of thing, like air, that it's easy to forget about when you're living in the midst of it. But take it away just for a minute by going somewhere else, some other part of the country, and you'll see just how powerful culture actually is in driving behavior. Michele didn't always want to study culture, I learned. When she was an undergraduate at Cornell, Colgate, she grew up in New York. I learned this morning, it's an insult to suggest she might have lived in New Jersey. Definitely not New Jersey, she's a New Yorker. She went to Colgate as an undergraduate, and it was on a trip overseas where she got really interested in culture. She came back and applied to graduate programs, and her boyfriend at the time, Todd, who is now her husband of 27 years, said, "You can go to graduate school and I'll follow you anywhere except to Urbana-Champaign in Illinois," which is, of course, exactly where she decided to go to graduate school, starting a long career in interest in the consequences of breaking rules. And what that does to your life. This turned out apparently not to be such an important rule for her to have broken, given that they've been married for 27 years. So what she has learned over the course of her time as an academic is that breaking rules like she did by going to Urbana-Champaign are more important in some places than others. That is, they mean more. Some cultures live in places where they are more tightly bound to rules than in other places where there's more of a laissez-faire kind of attitude. And if you're like me, once you learn about this research, you will start to see this aspect of life showing up everywhere. In places you hadn't seen it before, you will see Michele's distinction between cultural tightness and cultural looseness showing up in your own mind. You'll see it showing up in your family. You'll see it showing up in your office. You'll see it showing up in your community. You'll see it showing up around the world. She'll show you air that you hadn't seen before. For 25 years, Michele worked building this research on cultural tightness and looseness as a professor at the University of Maryland. Just last year, she swapped coasts and she moved to the Stanford GSB, where she's been just for this last year, acculturating to the business world. Tonight she's going to tell us about the work that she has built her career on and the work that she describes in her book, Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, How Tight and Loose Cultures Wire Our World. You're in for a great talk. Please join me by welcoming Michele as our speaker tonight.
Thank you so much for coming here tonight. I'm just delighted to be here to tell you about the research that I've been doing on culture. And I'll start my talk with a story about two fish. And they're swimming along, and one fish that's passing by them says, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And they swim by, and one says to the other, "What the heck is water?" And this is a very simple story with a very profound point, which is that sometimes the most important realities around us are the things that we can't see, the things that we take for granted. And for fish, that is water. But for humans, that is culture. And culture is this really interesting puzzle because it's all around us 24/7, and it affects everything from our nations to our neurons. But it's only until we get outside of our cultural bubble do we realize that we are living our lives and being socialized with specific values and norms that guide our behavior, and they're invisible. And what's interesting is that as humans, we've made many technological feats. We've put a man on the moon. We've wired the earth. We've discovered the laws of physics. But what if we discovered the underlying laws of culture, these deeper codes that are driving our behavior? Then we might be able to build a better world for all of us. So as Nick said, I wasn't always so passionate about culture. I was actually pre-med at Colgate. And I loved that topic also. And now I do some cultural neuroscience that we can talk about in the Q&A. But at the time, as he mentioned, I'm a native New Yorker. And like the New Yorker cartoon, which you see, we sort of acknowledge New Jersey. That's a big deal, I would say. But then there's basically, a bunch of rocks in the Pacific Ocean. And this view of the world got really challenged. As Nick said, when I went away to London for a semester abroad, I was the first kid in my family to go abroad, a sheltered kid from Long Island, as we pronounce it. And I was experiencing a lot of culture shock. And I remember calling my father, Marty from Brooklyn, and confiding in him all the culture shock I was experiencing from the strange sights and sounds and smells, but also things like people just going from London to Paris or London to Amsterdam just for the weekend. And he said, well, think about it like it's going from New York to Pennsylvania. And I thought this was the most amazing, comforting metaphor, and this is a true story. The very next day, I booked a trip to Egypt, low-budget tour, couple-of-week tour on the Nile. And my dad was like, what do you think you're doing? And I'm like, Papa, it's like me going from New York to California. Don't worry about it. And it was in Egypt and later travels and working on a kibbutz and really experiencing the world that I recognized how little I knew about culture, how important it was for defining who I was, this kid from Long Island. And yet I realized I really must know very little about myself if I don't know about culture. So I went back to Colgate, pivoted from pre-med, and I went to get a PhD in cross-cultural psychology by Harry Triandis, who happened to found the field of cultural psychology here in Champaign-Urbana. And I really wanted to use the tools of science to understand culture. And then the rest is history. I've been traveling around the world, noticing lots of contrasts. For example, for many of you that have been to Singapore, you'll notice that there's a lot of rules that you need to abide by, or else you might be fined more formally. For example, you're not allowed to litter, you can't spit, you can't bring large quantities of gum into the country. Even walking naked in front of your curtains at night can land you a fine. That's a true story, so just watch out if you go to Singapore. If you take a short plane ride over to New Zealand, you might see people walking barefoot in banks. I don't know if anyone's seen this. New Zealand is the only country that I know of that had its own national wizard. This guy, it was the national wizard of New Zealand, and he was actually a fired professor from Australia who landed in the streets of New Zealand, and he was lecturing on everything from rugby to religion, and making a ruckus of the place. And basically, the Prime Minister of New Zealand at the time said, would you like to be our wizard? And your job is to entertain the country. And that is what he did. He would launch himself from gigantic eggs on libraries and all sorts of other things. There's all sorts of interesting contrasts you see around the world. For example, for those of you that have been to Germany, you might notice that in many places people wait patiently on the streets, even if there's no cars around. In my own home state of New York City, you see people constantly jaywalking, even with kids in tow. And these examples really reflect something more fundamental. Even though they're very distinct and different examples, they reflect how strictly people abide by social rules that either can be unwritten or more formal and written in codes and laws. And social norms are this incredible invention by humans. They really help us to coordinate and predict each other's behavior at an unprecedented level. And one way to think about this is, what would the world look like without social norms? So try to imagine a thought experiment where you walk into an elevator and people are shaking their umbrellas and they're standing backwards. Try doing that sometime, and just see how they look at you. Or go into a restaurant and start just asking people to borrow their food and to munch on their food. Or go into a library and start singing and dancing. Or even in this talk, I could have started, do some weird stuff. And Nick would say we got to be more selective about who we invite here. There's a reason why we also don't have sex in public settings, like in movie theaters or in public parks, most of us, because that is something that would really disrupt the social order. So in many ways, you can think about social norms as really the glue that keeps us together and helps us really, as a society, we'd collapse without social norms. And what I've been really interested in is how strong that social glue is around the world. It's what we call the difference between tight cultures and loose cultures. Tight cultures have very strict norms and punishments for deviance, and they restrict the range of behavior that's seen as permissible. And loose cultures are much more weak in terms of their normative structure, and they have more permissiveness, a wider range of behavior that's seen as permissible. And I'm just very interested in this distinction to try to understand how can we measure tight and loose, and also what are its consequences for human groups? What are the trade-offs that it confers? And why does it evolve even in the first place? And what I want to talk to you today is about a fractal pattern of tight-loose. Fractal it's a metaphor coming from physics that we can look to see whether there's a repeated pattern of tight-loose across different levels, from nations to neurons, and see whether or not we can find some logic that pertains to all of these different levels of analysis. So today I'm going to take you on a little journey where we talk about these different levels. At first I'll start with the national level. Then we'll talk about zooming in the US. Can we see variation in tight-loose at the state level? What about organizations that we live in? Can we differentiate organizations that have strict rules versus that are more permissive? I'm in the Silicon Valley, so I can tell you right away that yes, we could do that. Also in our own households and our own mindsets. At the end of the talk, I'm going to talk about how you can assess where you fall on this continuum. I'm going to give you a little quiz at the end, so you can start thinking about this and see whether or not you can predict your own scores on the tight-loose mindset inventory. And again, across these levels, why do they evolve? What are their consequences? And also, I want to talk about how do we change them? How do we pivot when we need to? How do we negotiate these differences in all sorts of settings? And I'll give some examples when it comes to organizations, but also we'll talk about COVID-19 toward the end and what we learn about this distinction. So that's the menu for tonight. Let me start with the most broad level of analysis, which was the international level. This was a study we did across 30+ nations. As we were gathering survey data around the world, we were also studying the characteristics of nations, their histories, their ecologies. We were also doing some unobtrusive observations in city streets around the world. And we wanted to simply see, can we reliably measure how strict or permissive social norms are across countries? We assume that, of course, all countries have tight or loose elements. For example, this is a pretty tight setting. But we thought maybe we'll be able to reliably differentiate on a continuum those countries that veer tight versus those that veer loose. And that's exactly what we found. We found that countries such as Japan, Singapore, Austria, Germany tended to veer tight. Cultures like the US, Brazil, Greece, the Netherlands tended to veer looser. And what we were interested in is seeing what is the trade-off? What are these things correlated with, and why might they have evolved in the first place? So I want to just give you the big picture. The trade-off that we found across nations is what we refer to as the order versus openness trade-off. So tight cultures tend to have a lot of order. They have much lower crime, and they have more monitoring, whether it's police per capita or security cameras. A colleague of mine, Ara Norenzayan at UBC, would say people who feel watched, feel accountable, and they abide by rules, and that's really what we see with this kind of indicator. How many people listen to Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me on Sunday mornings? Peter Sickle, how can you not? We're here in Chicago. So I was listening to him, and he was telling a story about what do Japanese police officers need more of? And we're all guessing, maybe they need higher pay, maybe they need more vacation time. Turns out they need more crime. And it turns out that because they're so bored, because the crime rate is so low in Japan, that they were trying to egg people on to commit minor crimes. So that's just an example of order. We find that tight cultures also have more uniformity in terms of what people wear, what cars they drive. Even the clocks in city streets have more alignment in tight cultures. We've actually measured this. And we can see that in contexts like in Germany or in Japan, the clocks in city streets are off by milliseconds. But if you go to Greece or Brazil and you look at the clocks around the city streets, you're not entirely sure what time it is. We also know that tight cultures, again, with respect to order, have much more self-discipline and self-control. If you live in a context that has a lot of rules, from a very early age, you're socialized to manage your impulses, to monitor your behavior, and to adapt to the normative context. Like we do in libraries, or like we do in the funerals, or other contexts, we manage our impulses. So when you're repeatedly experiencing situations that are stronger, that have stricter rules, you develop that muscle for self-control much more than in contexts where you have weaker norms, when there's more permissiveness. We also know that, for example, tight cultures have less obesity and less debt, and they have less alcoholism and drug abuse. So there's all sorts of ways in which we see that self-discipline manifest at the macro level. Now, loose cultures struggle with order. They have higher crime, they have less synchrony, and they have a host of self-regulation failures. But they corner the market on openness. And we can see this in a variety of different indicators. They have more tolerance on all sorts of large-scale studies. The World Values Survey, we can see that they are more open to immigrants, to people of different races, religions, sexual orientations. Even when we actually can send our arrays out around the world with various stigmas, we see that they're helped more in looser cultures. And as an example, I had my research assistants trained in Germany to go back to their home countries. They were wearing fake facial warts that I bought them. You can buy them on the internet, just FYI. I also, in another condition, had them wearing tattoos and nose rings and purple hair. And in the other condition, they were just wearing their normal face. And they were sent out with a standardized script to ask for help in stores as well as in streets. And when people were just wearing the normal face, there was no cultural difference in helping behavior. But as I mentioned, they were far more likely to be helped in loose cultures when they were wearing these kind of stigmas. Loose cultures also have more creativity. In large-scale crowdsourcing studies, we see that people from loose cultures are more likely to enter those contests, and they're more likely to win. And in general, loose cultures tend to be more adaptable. When new styles and norms and new norms that have a better economic value enter into the population, they're more likely to take off more quickly in loose cultures. So you can see that there's real trade-offs where loose cultures have issues with order, tight cultures really struggle with openness. So the question here is, what predicts this? You know, what might actually explain why these differences exist? We didn't find that GDP was a reliable differentiator between tight and loose cultures. There are tight cultures that are rich and poor, and loose cultures that are rich and poor. We didn't see any common language or religion or geographic location that united tight cultures on the one hand and loose cultures on the other. But what our theory was really pretty simple. We hypothesized and found that tight cultures tend to have a lot more chronic threat throughout their histories. Threat can be coming from Mother Nature or human nature. And the idea is really simple. When you have a lot of chronic threat, you need stricter rules to coordinate to survive. And as I mentioned, this can come from human-made threats. Think about how many times your nation's been potentially invaded. Like in the US, we haven't been chronically worried about Canada and Mexico invading us. At least most of us have not thought that. US is separated by 2 oceans in terms of, from other continents. Also, Mother Nature. Think about Mother Nature's fury. This is not randomly assigned around the world. Some countries experience chronic natural disasters, chronic famine, don't have much arable land, and so forth. Also, we can think about things like pathogen prevalence. And we measured all of these things. As we're collecting data, we measured countries' histories over the last 100, sometimes over the last 500 years, to see whether or not we can show any kind of proof of concept that the more chronic threats you had, the higher the tightness. By the way, not all threats fell into this category. For example, with the territorial threat, we reasoned it wasn't just about how much your country was involved in threat. So the US has been involved in threat all over the world. The question for us is, it has to be on your own territory, because that really relates to the need for coordination and stricter rules to survive. And so this is what we found in this study. We found some evidence that when we look at as population density is increasing, we see the same with tightness, same with food deprivation, disasters, territorial threat over the last 100 years, pathogen prevalence, all tended to push groups toward tightness. Now, not all tight cultures have a lot of threat. Not all loose cultures have been on easy street. There's also other predictors of tight-loose, including how much mobility is there. When there's a lot of mobility, it's harder to agree upon rules. Or diversity. When you have more diversity in general and a lot of debate, then it also pushes groups toward looseness. But nevertheless, we see this pattern pretty clearly in the national data. Once we start thinking about why do cultures evolve the way they do, might there be some ecological pressures for certain types of values and norms that can help us be less ethnocentric about those contexts? So let's go back to the Singapore context, where you're not allowed to bring large quantities of gum into the country. If you tell Americans about this, they think it's ridiculous. Like, why can't people chew gum? When you think about having a context where there's over 20,000 people per square mile, it kind of sounds reasonable that Lee Kuan Yew, who's kind of a cultural psychologist, said, you know, guys, like, this gum is causing a lot of problems. People chew their gum and they throw it on the floor. It's becoming a national hazard. You know, this gum is wadding up elevator sensors and all sorts of train problems on the subway. So he said, you know, we're gonna have to ban this tasty treat given how small of an area that we all live in. And in fact, there's a lot of potential chaos in that context where rules can help avoid that chaos. I wanna mention this is not just a modern phenomenon. This is something we could see applying to small-scale societies that predate modern nations. All over the world, we can look at small-scale societies. This is what we did when we partnered with some anthropologists. This is my colleague Joshua Jackson, and we're partnering with Carol Ember, who's an anthropologist. We can start coding ethnographies for how strict or permissive they were across various different domains, whether it's socialization or gender or marriage. And we can see whether or not the same pattern is found in pre-industrial societies, and that's exactly what we found in a paper we published a few years ago, that the more density, the more warfare, more pathogens, more scarcity, the tighter we can see these pre-industrial societies. So this is just to suggest that we can see this pattern in modern nations, we can see it in historical contexts. What about zooming in? Let's sort of talk about this fractal pattern, because of course countries are diverse. Can we look at a place like the United States, which is really diverse, and can we start studying states? Maybe we can move beyond red and blue to think about variation across the 50 states in the US, and that's what we did in another paper. We classified countries based on, states based on survey measures we had, as well as other objective measures. Things like how many teachers use corporal punishment in schools? That's an indication of strictness and punishments. How many dry counties are there in a state? That's an example of constraint versus latitude. It's probably why I've never moved to Utah or to Indiana, for example. And these things all co-vary together, and we can then put a state on a metric of tight and loose. But even more interestingly, we can start looking at the predictors, and that's exactly what we did in this study. We looked at the same kind of ecological variation. And in fact, state-level tightness is predicted by some of the similar types of patterns that we saw in the national data. We know that natural disasters vary around the country. Kansas, for example, is hit with lots of natural disasters. It tends to veer tight in our data. Illinois, by the way, is moderately loose, just to let you know, and Indiana tends to veer tighter. We also see pathogens, scarcity, and those context states that have a lot of rural populations where there's a lot of gossip mill and a lot of monitoring tend to veer on the tighter side. And we also see that the same order versus openness trade-off can be found at the state level in the US. We gathered lots of data on this order and openness trade-off, and you'll see that, for example, tight states have people who have more conscientiousness. This is a measure of the Big Five personality that has to do with rule orientation. They have less homelessness, less divorce, less mobility, more law enforcement per capita. They also have lower drug use, particularly recreational drug use, and less debt, even controlling for other factors. Loose states struggle with these things, but on the openness side, they have more people who score higher in openness. They have more creativity. We measured this in terms of patents and foreign artists per capita, and they have more equality in terms of discrimination claims and minority-owned businesses, controlling minorities, and so forth. So the same kind of pattern you can see across this level of analysis. Tight-loose is not a static construct. It changes over time also. I can see people are probably wondering about this. You know, we think about the US, 100 years ago, even beyond that. Was it as loose as today? Probably not. And we can actually assess that. That's what we try to do as scientists. We try to find, now we can't go back and survey people back then, but we can develop measures to try to get at this construct using linguistic measures and looking at how the language that people use over time has changed. So for example, in this particular paper, again with my colleague Josh Jackson and partners with Soham Day in the Computer Science Department and Amber Fox, we wanted to try to develop a dictionary, a linguistic dictionary, signature of tight and loose. You can see the words that we found using large corpora that coalesced around tight words included things like prevent, comply, constrain, uphold, confine. Looser words included things like freedom, create, openness, leeway, flexibility. And what you see here in this graph is that over the last 200 years, we see that looseness has been rising and tightness has been decreasing in American texts and large corpora that we were analyzing. But what's even more interesting is whether this predicts the order and openness trade-off I was telling you about. So as we were gathering this data, we wanted to get at whether or not we see shifts in openness, but also disorder as looseness is increasing. And that's exactly what you see here. What we know from this data, controlling for lots of trends, is that periods of looseness are associated with more creativity in the United States, more patents, more trademarks, more films, but less order in terms of truancy and debt. So this is a trade-off we even see over time that we experience here in the US. So one more fractal pattern I want to talk about before I want you to vote on which you think is better, tight or loose. But I want first to ask you to think about this prompt. When I say follow the rules, just think about what comes up in your mind. Kind of what kind of statements in your mind is that you just think of naturally when I say follow the rules. This is an unobtrusive measure of how people make meaning around rules. And we can code this for the valence that people have and what they say about rules, and that's exactly what we do. Some people will say things like nuisance, goody two-shoes, like, kind of, overly sensitive. They think rules are, made for, people who are too conformists. Other people that we've surveyed about this will say good, structure, order. They like rules. Now, if you go into any American bookstore, you will see lots of books on break the rules. Like, I've even found books that are for children that are how to create anarchy. Like, I can show you this, it's actually in my office. And so you can see mainstream American culture really is focused on breaking the rules. But what we're really interested to see is, are there differences even in the US at a different level now, zooming into states, in terms of social class? So we often think about social class as really just about our bank accounts. But actually, what we can see is that, in fact, there's big differences culturally in the working and upper class in terms of tight-loose. And our theory in this data was, in this project, was that, working class are subject to a lot of potential threats. They have to worry about falling into poverty, into hard living, what sociologists call the chance of having to be subject to the dregs of poverty. They live in more dangerous neighborhoods. They live in occupations that are more dangerous and that also have less discretion. And there's been some work on this in sociology. Melvin Cohen has looked at how parents are training their kids, like good job analysis, like where they say, hey, they're going to be in occupations that are going to have more discretion, then we're going to help them to become more anti-conformist, versus those that have more constraint. We wanted to actually measure threat and see whether or not threat is an additional predictor to help explain working and upper class kids, and that's exactly what we found. In studies of over 1,000 people, we can see that the working class has greater tightness. They talk about positive things about rules in that prompt I gave you. They report more tightness in lots of different contexts, their daily life. They also like tightness, it's desired. I'm gonna sort of get to later on why kind of people who are promising to return people to a tight social order might be more appealing to people who experience a lot of this kinds of threat that we know of is happening in the working class. We found through our data collected at the zip code level that in fact working class live in more dangerous areas, and they also report having higher threat. And that in part explains some of the differences we find in tight-loose. I'll just say that these differences are found very early in age. Our most recent samples, the youngest samples we've surveyed, are about 3 years old. This is a girl from the working class whose parent gave me permission to show this picture. Now, we can't exactly ask these kids, what do you think of rules? They look at you kind of strangely. But what we can do is we can have them interacting with a puppet. This is Max the puppet. It's really lovely to watch people interacting. They're playing with Max, and they're playing these new games. And then Max does something kind of weird in the middle of the experiment. He starts violating the rules. And he's announcing, I'm playing the rules correctly. And you just simply videotape these kids and see, what do they do? Do they protest? Do they laugh? Well, it turns out that the working class kids are much more likely to protest against Max than the upper class kids. Because those kids have been trained even as young as 3 years old because they have a cushion that it's okay to break the rules. So we see these differences arising very early. They also produce later in life some of the same trade-offs that I mentioned. When we bring people into the laboratory, Working class tend to be more rule-abiding, and they also tend to be less creative, just like we see at other levels. By the way, there's some colleagues of mine at UC Berkeley that looked at this in the field, where they looked at which cars in California are more likely to violate the rules, including trying to cut off pedestrians, which is against the law. Cars like BMWs and Mercedes, much more likely to do that stuff as compared to plumber vans and so forth. So this is found also in the wild. So let me just pause for a minute and ask you, which is better, tight or loose? If you were to vote right now, how many people would vote, if you had to design a world, how many people would vote for tightness? How many people would vote for looseness? How many people are going to abstain? Okay, so this is a classic, interesting question around how do we design societies. Plato, Confucius, certainly Hobbes thought we should have tightness. But then John Stuart Mill, even Freud, he thought rules make us neurotic. He was kind of neurotic, right? And the question is, what's the right answer? What's the data say? And we sort of reason maybe it's neither. Maybe groups need to veer tight or loose for good reasons, but it's the groups that get to the extremes, either extraordinarily tight or super loose, that have a lot of dysfunction for different reasons. When you're in a context that's really super constrained, it makes you feel repressed, and it makes you want to exit that situation, something Durkheim called fatalistic suicide. But on the flip side, extreme looseness, what he called anemic suicide, anemy meaning disorder or normlessness, can also be untenable because you can't coordinate your action at all. So we wanted to see, can we see evidence of this, that actually there's this curvilinear, nonlinear relationship between tight, loose, and well-being. And that's exactly what we found. Looks like a kind of a crazy graph, but it's basically a U-shaped curve where the extremes are showing higher depression, higher blood pressure, higher suicide, and lower well-being. Now, this is not something that's just important for the national level. When you start thinking about freedom and constraint in all sorts of settings, you can think about this pattern of how do we avoid these extremes. So for example, we know in decision-making that having too much choice or too little choice, this is another way to relabel that phenomena, having extraordinary looseness and extraordinary tightness also produces dissatisfaction. So those extremes are really problematic. It's the same with leadership. We know from the leadership literature that leaders that provide too little discretion, that are really directive, that don't give people any autonomy, or they're very authoritarian, produce really unsatisfied followers, unmotivated followers. But so is the flip side, that when leaders provide too much discretion, when they're laissez-faire, when there's so much job autonomy, this happened a lot during COVID, right? It was really hard for us to kind of maintain those connections with our followers and with our subordinates and so forth. Even academic advisors, I've recently seen some discussion around this, when people talk about those that are ineffective, talk about both extremes of hovering too much or not being involved at all. And we can think about this with parenting. For those of you, that are parents, that, it's really tough to raise kids because we want to really monitor our kids a lot. But we know that overly strict parents, those helicopter parents, produce kids who have a lack of self-discipline, who develop depression and anxiety, and also who, when they're released into the wild, can actually not have the ability to self-regulate. But at the same time, overly lax parents produce very also maladaptive kids as well, with poor working habits, who engage in risky behavior and so forth. So what this suggests, and this is kind of the end of part 3 of the talk, is that how do we think about negotiating tight-loose? How do we create the kind of balance in any social system, at any level of analysis, to have both empowerment but also accountability? And this just suggests that we need to identify, diagnose contexts that we think where we need to loosen tight norms, but also we might need to identify contexts where we need to tighten social norms. Culture is invisible and it's omnipresent. But if we understand the logic of it, then we can actually be intentional. We can engage in intentional cultural change. And this is just to say that culture is not destiny. We can actually manage it overtly and mindfully. And I'm just going to give you a couple examples. I work now a lot with the US Navy. I'm also working with some online platforms to try to deal with these issues in very different ways and pivoting in different directions. But you can think about organizational cultures. For many of you that work in organizations, think about your own organization. Where does it fall on the tight-loose continuum? Certainly, some organizations need to veer tight. Airlines, hospitals, the military. We don't want them making all sorts of crazy decisions. They have a lot of threat, and they have a lot of coordination needs. But sometimes they can start getting too tight. You saw this with United Airlines. I think the military is concerned about this because we know that the trade-off is order and openness, and the military wants to be more innovative. And we know we can diagnose this through unobtrusive observations, but also through surveys, where overly tight organizations start looking helicopter-like, very standardized, having a lot of rules, people being afraid to speak out. Overly loose organizations, though, are also problematic. We can see this in the Silicon Valley. I live there now, and I can attest to that. We can see it online. We can see it in this wild, wild west of social media where we now live. They're very chaotic. There's not a lot of accountability or oversight, unpredictable. In organizations, this can, I see I'm getting a 10-minute, I'm not sure if that's negotiable, but okay. We see it in reviews on Glassdoor. We can analyze Glassdoor reviews in terms of how people talk about their organizations vis-a-vis tight and loose. Are too disorganized and decentralized, minimal top-down strategy, very chaotic, irregular rules, or ultra-tight, very hierarchical, rigid, inflexible, micromanaging to the point of how many times you use the restroom. So this suggests that we can actually try to be more ambidextrous. Ambidextrous meaning we can try to pivot as needed and be tight and loose mindfully. And this is what we've been starting to do. We've been developing ways in which we can loosen up tight cultures. We call this flexible tightness. These cultures need to be tight in many respects, but maybe we can insert some discretion into these contexts, like the military and airlines, hospitals. Likewise, we can also try to tighten up loose cultures. We call this structured looseness, where we insert some accountability and structure into these contexts. And I'm just going to give two examples, and then we'll move on to COVID, my last tight-loose ambidexterity quest. Flexible tightness, how do you loosen tight organizations? We call this the ease model, and we've been doing this with the Navy. First of all, we can examine whether a rule is really necessary. In trying to also pivot from tight to loose in these contexts, we can allow exploration free time to help people to really think outside of the box. Decentralizing the structure is also very helpful for loosening and encouraging pushback. But also, structured looseness on the flip side requires something very different. We call this the secure model. Here we want to set clearer boundaries and benchmarks and establish structure. Centralizing is more useful in this context when we're trying to insert some accountability and oversight, emphasizing reliability and enforcing the rules. These are ways that we can start introducing some accountability into these contexts. Now, I want to say this is really the devil's in the details. This is obviously not easy to do. It's difficult to do it for different reasons. When we're trying to loosen tight organizations, this threatens the need for control. These are contexts that have had a lot of safety needs and coordination needs. So when you have these manufacturing firms, and I've worked with, that want to suddenly loosen, that's really difficult because it threatens that need for control and order. And we need to take baby steps in this kind of context, implement small changes. On the flip side, when we're trying to insert some tightness into a loose system, there's a lot of pushback because of autonomy. I interviewed some people in the early days of Microsoft who talked about this, who said, there was so much looseness and they need to tighten. So they had to actually get people to be involved in the change, to get them to feel empowered, to buy into it, to do it collaboratively. So I can talk more about this in the Q&A, but let me just finish with talking about tight, loose, and COVID-19. This is such a difficult time. In fact, rule makers, rule breakers are published right before COVID. And never did I, in my wildest imagination, think I'm going to be studying a global pandemic and a global threat. I've been studying threat for years. I've been studying pathogens kind of from a distance. So suddenly I had to start thinking about, what does this portend? Which cultures are going to do better during COVID and why? And I wrote an op-ed about this in the Boston Globe in early March. And I said, look, there's a lot of research out there, mine and others, that would suggest that it's adaptive to tighten during collective threat temporarily. And in fact, we've done this during 9/11, we've done this during World War II, et cetera. So maybe this is going to happen naturally. But then I thought, this is a different kind of threat. COVID is invisible, it's a germ. It's a lot more easy to ignore it than to ignore warfare or terrorism. And also we started thinking, we've never really looked to see whether loose cultures take longer to tighten during a global threat. And this is what evolutionary biologists actually call evolutionary mismatches. They talk about this not with respect to culture, but with respect to other aspects of human functioning. And the idea is simple. It's that traits that have evolved in one environment that can be really advantageous in that context, like loosenesses for innovation, can be highly disadvantageous in environments when that trade is not needed and or it's actually problematic for dealing with the new environment. Now, environmental changes can occur very rapidly. That's what we saw here. And this sort of suggested to us maybe we might see liabilities of looseness during COVID. Not all loose cultures, but this is what we wanted to study. And this is what we found. This graph shows the correlation between tightness and cases per capita. Basically what it says is that the higher the tightness, the lower the cases. This is also controlling for lots and lots of different factors, including wealth and inequality and density and government intervention and testing and so forth, and lots of other factors. This is published in the Lancet Planetary Health just a couple months ago. Same thing with deaths per capita. But what was even more astonishing about this data is that we saw big differences in the amount of fear that people had of COVID around the world. And it was astonishing. This is YouGov data across 20-something countries. They measured how fearful people were of COVID from the day one in a country of a case up until the end of the fall of 2020. And tight cultures just had more fear from the beginning and even into the fall, even though they were doing better in terms of COVID. And loose cultures had much less fear. When you don't have, another way of thinking about this is when you don't have the threat instinct that is, or threat signal that is reaching people, when it's been interfered with or it's been muted or so forth, like it can happen in a global threat like a pandemic where it's invisible, then it's going to be a problem. And in fact, this kind of partially mediated some of the cases and deaths data. Now, that's not to say that looseness is not a great thing. It sure is. But we need to be mindful of how should we be ambidextrous in future threats? How can we pivot when it's necessary? Clearly, I think some of the lessons we've learned that hopefully we'll take into the future threats that we have is that we need to be much more clear and consistent in terms of our messaging. Make the threat concrete. Make it concrete from people who we trust locally, particularly in loose cultures. That matters a lot, from our barbershops, from our priests and our rabbis. Also reminders that tightness is temporary, that there's some evolutionary adaptation of tightening during threat, and that the faster we tighten, the faster we reduce the threat. That's something we've seen with a lot of our modeling, and the faster we can get back to our freedom. And of course, national identity really helps in this matter. Some cultures, like New Zealand, that are famously loose with the crazy wizard, actually were able to be ambidextrous. They were able to pivot with really good leadership and also with a population that was willing to all uphold the rules. So I'll end with, am I still on time? Woo! I have a wooing problem, apparently. According to my husband, I have a wooing problem. I want to just get to the final level of analysis, which is your own tight, loose mindset. And I'll ask you, using Dolly Whitlock's fabulous metaphor, are you an order Muppet or a chaos Muppet? So are you like, Bert and Kermit the Frog, who notice a lot of rules, who like to avoid making mistakes, and also who like a lot of structure? Bert's known to collect paper clips and so forth. He's always immaculately dressed, and his roommate Ernie drives him crazy because the chaos Muppets, as we call them, don't really notice rules. They're a little more impulsive. They like to take risks, and they tolerate a lot of ambiguity. And it's a really interesting distinction. I like to use the word mindsets because it really is about these different psychological affordances of strong or weak norms, noticing rules, managing impulses, and how we deal with structure or lack thereof. And we all fall on the default to continuum, even though we can sort of activate our inner Bert when we're in a library or in a symphony, or we can kind of let our inner Cookie Monster animal let loose when we're in a public park or when we're at a dinner. But we all, for our own reasons, based on our own cultural experiences, the kind of threats we've dealt with in our lifetime and so forth, we have a certain place on this continuum. I have a little QR quiz so you can take the quiz. And, I will say, I'm going to be honest, I veer moderately loose on my own quiz. My husband, Todd, who, by the way, is from Chicago, woo! He veers moderately tight. He's an attorney, so he has a lot of accountability all the time, like billable hours, the whole, kind of accountability that goes with being a lawyer or a public servant. And, once you start thinking about your own mindset, you can ask yourself, why might I have scored this way on the quiz? What about my own background makes that natural for me? But then we can start thinking about our partners or our bosses or our neighbors or our kids and start thinking about, why might they be the way they are? And why might that make sense? It kind of promotes cultural empathy. And then maybe even further than that, how do we negotiate these differences? Because, for example, I get a lot of pushback on how I load the dishwasher. Really annoying to my spouse. But, we can start thinking about, even in our household, how do we think about which domains do we need to be tight or loose in? And then we can actually negotiate that. We can each get our highest priority. It sounds a little cheesy, but I also teach negotiation. So we got to think about win-win agreements. And my poor kids have had to live through this. Neither of them are social scientists. They all went to marine science. But the point mainly is that we can actually negotiate this and actively construe the level of norm strength we want in different domains, even in our own private lives. And I'd be really curious, after you take the quiz, if you can email me on my website, you can see all my information, and my contact information is right here. But I would love to hear about any ways in which this distinction, you've seen it operate in your own lives, whether it's as you read the newspaper, whether it's your own conflicts with various people in your lives, and just anything you've noticed about this now that you've heard more about this, this cultural code. So I want to just, on behalf of the group here, thank you for attending Think Better, and thanks for having me. It really was a joy to be here. Back in Chicago, I spent a lot of time here in grad school because I was escaping from Champaign, although I did love Champaign-Urbana, and I eventually loved all the corn. And I still have the most fond memories. I feel very fortunate to have gotten my PhD at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. So thank you very much, and I would love to hear questions and comments, and that's it.
Thank you, Michelle. So we do have time for some questions. There are 2 mics here. I wanted to start it off with a question from our Zoom audience. How can you authentically understand the cultural norms of a society when you're not a member of that culture?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. It actually speaks to something that we've been measuring in psychology now, which we call CQ, or cultural intelligence. And actually, it's distinct from IQ, and it's distinct from EQ, emotional intelligence. And it's a muscle that we can develop through our active engagement in the norms and values of a culture, whether through reading, through movies, and so forth. But CQ is also informed by having cultural mentors. I know when I go to the Middle East a lot, which is quite frequent, and I have a big research team out there where we're studying things like the psychology of honor, I constantly, even I'm a cross-cultural psychologist, am violating norms of honor all the time. Like if I'm on my phone, when I'm trying to talk to my colleague, they're like, hey, you're disrespecting me. Like, am I not important enough that, you can't put your phone down? Or other things like that. And I have cultural mentors that will tell me honor violation. Like, you're a cultural psychologist, you need to get some help in any context from the locals and help to understand the important cultural codes. So I think it's an active life quest and a journey to be high in CQ. CQ matters a lot. I have a new handbook coming out on cross-cultural organizational behavior, whole chapter that's devoted to cultural intelligence, how it affects mergers and acquisitions, how it affects leaders of diverse teams. People who have high CQ create organizations that are more inclusive, and they also do better in the global environment. So it's worth it. It matters. It also matters for negotiation and intercultural negotiations when we study it above and beyond IQ. You can be really super smart, and you can be even emotionally intelligent, but CQ is really what drives success in intercultural interactions.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I was thinking about that follow the rules thing and the reaction that I got, and I was thinking that personally I find rules easier to follow when I understand the underlying principles or values that it's trying to embody. So I don't know if you've done any research about maybe tight cultures in which principles are explained versus tight rules in which they're just kind of by fiat. That could be a distinction between different kinds of tight cultures.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you've done any research on that.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And we haven't, but I think it's a really interesting point because what we suspect is that over time, people don't really understand even why they're performing the rules. They don't really think about it. Even silly rules. There's actually a new emerging literature on silly rules. Why do people in the military have to have a certain type of socks? Or why do we legislate the kind of haircuts they're going to have? There's silly rules. They seem to have no function. Why are we doing this? But actually, it turns out in some initial modeling done by some colleagues of ours, like actually what we're finding is that groups that have a lot of silly rules actually are more willing to comply with the rules that are really important. So, and that's, I think, the logic in the Navy also, is that people learn that they'll follow these silly rules, that they're going to comply with the rules that are important on the battlefield. So I think in large part, sometimes rules seem like kind of really silly, but they seem to co-evolve with contexts where there's really important reasons to obey rules that you don't want to keep explaining to people. This is why we do this, and this is what's happening. They're kind of, they have sort of opaque in a lot of ways, and rituals are like that too. So I think that cultures that have a lot of rules tend to also have these rituals where people are not thinking about them. But I would like to talk to you about, maybe we can design some research on that. We're always looking for new ideas here, right? This is like you're like our laboratory. And we're crazy scientists, so it would be really super cool to look at that, especially even with like the 3-year-olds and the younger kids, because that's really interesting. And I also think that under the context of threat, it's hard to keep talking about why we're doing these. Like you don't have a lot of time to do that. That might be why they become so opaque, some of the rule following.
Yeah, I'm curious, given your understanding of the difference between tight and loose cultures, how do you believe that influences like the proclivity for certain cultures to lean towards entrepreneurial activity or even the tolerance of entrepreneurial activity and failure?
Yeah, this is a great question. And actually, in the book, I talk about that. In fact, there's data that we've analyzed that show that loose cultures have far more tolerance for entrepreneurship types of careers. They're seen more positively. Clearly, it's much more of a loose code. But I will say that it's important that it doesn't mean that loose cultures are necessarily great at innovation. Because we think about innovation as being both creating ideas, but also being able to implement them. And actually, some loose cultures can come up with a lot of good ideas, but that doesn't mean they're going to be able to scale up. That requires tightness and it requires coordination. And likewise, tight cultures might not have a lot of idea generation, but they can really scale up. And so I differentiate entrepreneurship and creativity from innovation in that sense. And we have some recent evidence that we published that shows that actually having that kind of ambidexterity actually enables nations to be highly innovative in terms of having both tight and loose. And I think it's a key challenge in organizations is having these leaders who can help groups to promote openness and entrepreneurship, but also promote what we say closed leadership in terms of accountability structure, scaling up. And there's all sorts of ways that we can advise on that, but they're both needed. So yeah, the answer is yes, but the also no, in terms of the importance of both types of codes. Also, one last thing I'll say about that. I was interviewing a lot of people in the Silicon Valley, and it's an interesting phenomenon. Not surprisingly, there's a lot of loose mindsets of people who start these companies. They're really risky. And then, the dream of getting bought out and, going public and so forth is like amazing. But then what I found talking to people is that they invariably enter into tighter worlds. They're big organizations, they have to have tighter rules, and they're like, whoa, like this is not good. I feel really constrained, and I'm gonna go just start up another startup. I'm gonna be a serial startupper. And the kind of contempt is mutual. Because when we talk to people who are in, manufacturing contexts who realize they want to be looser, so they hire an R&D group or they bring on people who have looser mindsets, they just drive each other crazy, because they're missing deadlines and they're a little loosey-goosey on kind of protocol. And so what's, again, interesting about this is that we don't anticipate these differences. We don't think about this as, before we do this, what kind of cultural clashes are we going to have? This also applies to mergers and acquisitions. We've done a lot of work on mergers across cultures over the last 30 years. And again, with the best intentions, think of Daimler and Chrysler, best intentions. This was supposed to be an awesome merger, but what they didn't realize is this iceberg beneath the surface of what they're going to wind up having to deal with. And we've studied that more systematically. Now we can see the price tag that happens when tight and loose organizations merge. Again, it's negotiable, but most times we're not thinking about it. We're just thinking about the strategic compatibility. So that's just another, kind of thought when it comes to startups and entrepreneurship. Yeah.
Great. One more question.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I wanted to find out if you can tell me more a little bit about what you were reference to the ambidextrousness, because I work in a creative organization, so I have a lot of art directors and creative directors. But then we also have a lot of business people as well. And so you can imagine the collisions that we have. So I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that and how do you foster creativity and innovation in that type of environment?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a fascinating question. I think even the fact that you're asking that question says a lot, because often we just kind of make these attributions about people that, like, we don't really like them. They annoy us. Like, we don't think about, wait, they have certain strengths that we have liabilities on. In fact, the exact strengths of some cultures are the liabilities of others, and vice versa. And so once we start to appreciate, like, wow, we actually need each other. Like, we need both tight and loose in this organization, as here's what each party brings to their, or group brings to the table. Then it's a matter of creating a lot of joint kind of incentives and incentive structure to help people feel like they're really part of the same overarching goal and each participating in terms of order, efficiency, coordination versus creativity. I write a little bit about this in the book. There's various different ways in which we've seen that happen, like on the ground, and I'd be happy to tell you more about that and get more examples from you, because this is a really new emerging literature and topic of how we can be ambidextrous in all sorts of contexts. And who are these people, and what are their training, and how do we get people to appreciate each other's strengths, whether they're in marriages or they're in, mergers or so forth. So I think it can be done, and that's really what our charge is now, once to apply this knowledge in all sorts of contexts. So let's hear about your tight loose mindset quiz during the chatter after the talk, and whether you were surprised and what you think that may be from.
Thank you.